I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast Supplement.
Because people have been banging on our doors, begging for more content. Please give us more content. So here we are.
And Rob, you know, we serve the people.
We always serve the people. We're good students of Mao in this way. We do as the people command.
为人民服务, right?
That's it. That's it.
Rob,
exactly
actually,
it.
I think you actually have been, you're so much into the service of the people that you have been a fu yuan.
I totally have. I have been a fu yuan, or, you know, depending on where you are in China, it's fu yuan, fu yuan. There it is. There's the fu yuan. I remember that when I first moved to Tianjin, I thought that was the actual term, fu yuan. I didn't even know there were 3 characters. I just heard 2 syllables, you know.
We're making fun of the North Chinese
God,
accent
I love
for
the
those
North
who
China
don't speak
accent.
Chinese.
I will always love the North China accent until I die.
Anyways, so today, this supplemental episode is focused specifically on what?
Well, you know, the idea came out of, we're doing a long series on 100 years of Chinese literature. And a lot of what prompted our choices in the series was a scholarship we've been doing at the university in grad school, and thinking, you know, there's a lot of the stuff that people could really be reading. Some stuff is really just inside baseball and it's way too difficult, but a lot of other stuff needs to be read. It's out there.
Yeah.
So this is gonna probably be a recurring segment. It will sometimes be informed directly by a series we're doing. Sometimes it won't. We're not going to shoehorn it in just because.
So this last week we did a podcast on the 1900 to 1910, and so today's supplemental podcast is on
a work that, you know, this is the other thing, is you and I have tried to agree on what's the one thing that we're going to talk about from this week. And actually in the late Qing, for you and I, the choice was fairly easy in a way.
super easy.
So what we're going to be talking about, and this is going to be a short one, incidentally, if you can't already tell, this is going to be about 5 to 6 minutes, is Lin Shu Incorporated by Michael Gibbs-Hill.
Who is a scholar at William and Mary University in Virginia.
Yeah.
Great scholar. Great writer.
Yes, this is one of the handful of works on the late Qing. Not a lot has been written on the late Qing.
It's kind of like a black hole in Chinese literature and Chinese history.
Because there's not that much that's canonical from the period. You and I talked about this a little bit in the podcast, but it's nothing like the May 4th movement, where there's clear classics in modern Chinese literature. This is more experimental. It's a lot of translation. And Michael Gibbs-Hill figures out some really interesting things to do with translated literature in particular.
So first, just really quickly, who is Lin Shu and why is he incorporated?
So Lin Shu was hands down the most prolific translator in the late Qing. He translated over 180 works.
So Lin Shu must be an incredible scholar of English and French, right, Rob?
Except that, as though you haven't read the same stuff I have. I love when we ask questions that were clearly fake. Anyway, no, he spoke no other languages besides Chinese. This is one of the fun things about the story.
So hang on, he was a translator, but he spoke no languages other than Chinese.
It's so weird when you tell people about that. But he practiced what's called tandem translation. So you have one person who does speak the language, but is not a great writer and is not very proficient in classical Chinese. So that person translates it into whatever kind of meh Chinese they can. And then Lin Shu takes the meh Chinese and translates it into great classical or semi-classical Chinese.
So when we say classical Chinese, of course, we're talking about Wenyan Wen.
Wenyan Wen, yeah. That's a better term, actually.
And I think this is interesting, and Michael Gibbs-Hill, in his excellent work of scholarship, brings this out quite a bit. You have this element of style which gives authority. Mm-hmm. Like being able to write well in Wenyan Wen is kind of like the difference between writing a blog post and writing a book.
Yes.
In contemporary English, right? Like when you publish something that sounds like a blog post, it really loses a lot of its gravitas, its authority.
Right.
So what Lin Shu is doing is he's taking these translations and turning them from what's essentially a blog post to a work of scholarship, something that people who are smart can go, this guy knows what he's talking about, and it's completely unrelated to his capacity to like understand these things, but because you're speaking in this particular style, because you're writing in this particular style, it has gravitas.
And it's not too big an exaggeration to say one of the biggest reasons why Western literature even arrives in China is through Lin Shu, because when you study stuff from this period, the translator that most scholars talk about first is Yan Fu, who translated T.H. Huxley in 1895.
Did Darwin as well, right?
Yes. These are big major translations, but next to nobody read them, right? Now, when Lin Shu first translated Alexandre Dumas Fils' La Dame aux Camélias, the Lady of the Camellias, right at the turn of the century, 1900, 1899, 1900, it became a runaway bestseller. They were all kind of caught off guard. Oh, wow, people want to read this, right? So this blew the doors off the market for non-Chinese literature.
They really weren't expecting.
No.
Right? Like,
no, they were not expecting it. No, they were not expecting it. But if and I have written a dissertation chapter on this. I'm not going to bore you with all the specifics. Right? No one deserves that in a supplement like this. But the important part of it is that he was good enough in what he did to be able to sell this.
Yeah. So these were mostly works of literature.
Yes, and to bring it back to Michael Gibbs-Hill's work, what's essential about this work is that he combines wonderful commentaries on the actual history of the period with fantastic readings and analyses of translated text, which is not a lot of people do.
And he does it really well. It's very hard to kind of get the thing that Michael Gibbs-Hill does, which is thinking in terms of history and literature.
Yes.
So this is one of the reasons why we both immediately knew this work was one of the works we wanted to promote, because he writes in a way where you're learning about what's happening at the time while also learning about literature, which for someone who's like not a scholar of Chinese literature, that's attractive, right? Like you want to learn as much about the history around the literature as you do about the literature.
But ideally you'd get both, and he gives you both. And one of the fascinating things about this is, and he makes this comment, that most scholars in previous eras, or even now for that matter, who write about translation or write about the late Qing never actually read the translations. It's enough to write about the preface. This is what the translator meant to do. Let's just go off of that. Very few people study it because, frankly, it's boring.
And it's also very weird. Like
it's very strange.
Linguistically, and this would really, it's hard to explain to someone who doesn't speak Chinese, but the literary Chinese, the classical Chinese, the Wen that they are speaking is very difficult because it has elements of modern vernacular Chinese kind of sprinkled in there, but it also has elements of like classical Tang Dynasty Chinese, and this is the thing, Qing Dynasty Wen is also sprinkled in there. So you have these two versions of classical Chinese plus modern vernacular Chinese all kind of competing, and it makes complete sense to anyone who is reading it contemporaneously, who is educated in that, but it doesn't make sense. The best analogy I can think of is think of Isaac Newton writing Principia, right? Like he is writing, he's educated in the Latin of Horace and of Virgil, and so he's drawing off of stylistically that Latin, but he's also educated in the Latin of Oxford and Cambridge, and he's drawing off of that Latin, and then they're just words that he has to kind of make up for modern stuff. So you have these three different languages or three different registers kind of competing in these works. That's really hard.
On top of that, and we need to wrap this up because this was supposed to be a short supplement. On top of that, you have to deal with what's in the market right now. What are people reading? What are people expecting? There's a lot of things in, for example, The Lady of the Camellias that he translated first that would really have rubbed audiences the wrong way. So, of course, he did. Right, in China, so he changed them. And this is one of the fun things that Gibbs-Hill brings out in his work over and over again is he does not begin with the assumption that, okay, changing this was wrong and he should have done it. He goes, let's put that aside for a second and go, what did he change and why does that matter? So through the actual translated text, he gives you a glimpse of the people from that era, their morals, their ethics, their expectations. So you get at the same time the history of the last decade or so of the Qing transitioning into the Republic, but also how that actually plays out in a text.
And we can't leave Michael Gibbs-Hill's work without mentioning the chapter on Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Yes, which is worth the price of admission alone. And we've done a podcast
so
on
Uncle Tom's Cabin is one of the most popular works in the late Qing, surprisingly, because there's not that many Africans, there's not that many black folks in Qing China, and yet it still speaks powerfully to a Qing audience.
Yes.
Why?
Right, and that's one of the things he digs into is his ability to present the text in a way that he knows is going to find an audience. He's a very, very canny salesman.
Lin Shu is.
Yes. And
how does he sell it?
He presents it in terms of aggression by foreign powers. So the idea is, look, in terms of being pushed around by more powerful nations, and I apologize for the term, but this is what he uses, yellow people, not just Chinese, but all Asian sort of yellow people, he calls them, are being pushed around by the West. So this is a novel. He links it directly to the Chinese Exclusion Act, for example.
He links Chinese Western imperialism of China to the treatment of African Americans.
Right.
Which is fascinating because it shows you how interconnected the late Qing is to the rest of the world in terms of politics. Like they're discussing race in America. It's one of the most popular novels being translated. And yet it's still also this really odd world where it's not actually connected in some ways. Like they completely have a false understanding of what's going on. But that doesn't matter because it says a lot about Qing China.
Absolutely. And I'll make one final comment on this book. It's not very long. And this sounds like a kind of a negative selling point. It's really not. The number of great scholars who can give you a fantastic piece of scholarship in a concise, short, to-the-point package is vanishingly small. There's very, very few. This is one of them. And we'll be talking about more in other supplements like this, but it'll engage you. You'll learn about it. You will not need to spend the entire calendar year reading it, which is huge.
Paul de Silva, who wrote How to Write a Lot, says that one of the things that scholars find most challenging is to write a good scholarly piece short.
Yes, and this is
with
great
brevity.
So this is the first in our supplement for good reason. It's an absolutely essential work on China.
It's not only essential on China and learning about the late Qing, but it's also something you'll enjoy reading, even if you're a general reader.
He's a great teacher. He's a great
scholar.
Yeah, definitely check it out.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore,
and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast Supplement.